Well, I know that the company line is that we're not supposed to approve of Thomas, that he's Thomas the doubter, the one who didn't have enough faith to believe in the risen Christ, who had to see it for himself, because I know I've heard that sermon about 1,000,000 times growing up, and I've been in church a lot of times since I was born. But I have a confession to make, and that is that I've always secretly admired Thomas. I've really liked him as a character. And I really think upon close inspection of this reading that John, the gospel writer, does not want us to think about Thomas as a negative role model. Thomas in this gospel is one of the critical points of view for those of us who are reading the gospel. In other words, you are Thomas. Gospels are a genre. There were lots of them written in the early part of the Christian faith. Only 4 of them were included in the canon in our Bible: Mark, Matthew, Luke, John. The genre emerged at a time in the history of the church in order to solve a particular problem. Mark's gospel is written in the early 60s. Matthew and Luke probably a decade or a decade and a half after that. And John's gospel another decade or a decade and a half, maybe even 2 decades after that. So as late as the first decade of the second century. And the reason that people sat down at the task of writing about the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus is that at a certain point, the people who actually witnessed those events, and the people who knew people who had witnessed those events, and the people who knew the people who knew the people who knew the people who had witnessed those events, were all beginning to die off. That generation, it's like, I grew up hearing stories about World War II from my relatives. Now none of those people are here to tell those stories firsthand anymore. Which in a sense for the early church created a crisis, because at the very heart and center of our faith is the reality of Jesus Christ, his ministry, his teachings, his healings, his death on the cross, and his resurrection from the dead. That was great when we could hear somebody tell us about it. But when there's no longer that first-person connection to those events, how do we share forward into the next generation, and the generation after that, and the generation after that, the reality of Jesus Christ? And the gospel genre was one of the ways to do that. Last week I decided to preach on Mark's very short, clipped, and kind of unsatisfying gospel telling of the resurrection. And he ends his gospel, and they ran away and said nothing, for they were afraid. And we came to understand in that sermon, in that time together, that the reason he does that is because he understands that it's critical for the next generation of people to be able to tell that story. So he ends his gospel abruptly, specifically so that you will see yourself as the one who has to write the next chapter in the gospel. Are you going to run away? Are you going to say nothing? Are you going to be afraid? It's a task for a generation of people who are one generation removed from the real events. That's Mark's way of dealing with this crisis. John deals with it in a different way, by telling the story about the Apostle Thomas. He inserts a character in his narrative. He recounts an event that he remembers about somebody in Jesus' retinue who didn't believe it until he saw it. And he includes that account. None of the other gospel writers do. And he goes right on to, right after that, he says that kind of interesting little passage. He says, lots of other things happened in Jesus' life, but I've included these ones so that you can believe that Jesus is the Son of God. And Thomas, the story about Thomas is included so that you can deal with the reality of the fact that you are asked to believe things that you have not already seen. Thomas is not included in this story to be a negative role model. Don't be like Thomas. Don't doubt. Believe. He's included so that you can see and think about what is the process by which you can become convinced of the reality of Christ's crucifixion and resurrection, and can become his apostle, can become his disciple, can become his witness in the world. And I want to suggest to you that Thomas's doubt, is a critical component to what Thomas brings to that process of believing a thing that I have not seen, and believing it so intensely that I fall down on my knees and worship Christ, the risen Christ, and then devote my life to being an apostle and disciple. Thomas's doubt is a central component to that process from John's point of view, and I think it's a critical point in our life of faith. We've been told, and we sometimes believe, that doubt is the enemy of faith. And I want to suggest to you that that is not true. It might be the opposite, though not the enemy of belief, but it is not the enemy or the opposite of faith. In fact, doubt is an important and essential component and companion to faith. Hang on, it'll come to me. I'll talk about a confession of mine. Oh, I know what it was. Now I'm back on track. The place where I began to really embrace and understand this was I was reading a favorite author of mine, Frederick Buechner. And he makes the argument that that doubt is not the enemy of faith, that doubt is just the ants in the pants of faith. That doubt is a thing that just kind of keeps ruffling up the things that we have tamped down. We think we have it settled. We got that. And the problem with thinking that we've got it, thinking that it's all nailed down and that we understand it, is that then we can walk away from it and forget about it, and it is no longer vital, and it's no longer a part of our day-to-day process of living and understanding. Buechner's point is that the purpose of doubt is not to undermine faith, is not to lead you away from faith, but to keep itching faith so that you have to scratch it, so that you have to look at it, so you have to examine it, and so that you have to grow in it. When I was a child, I grew up in the church. I was in church every Sunday of my entire life, unless I was sick or on death's door. When I started out, I had a very simple faith. It had only a few components. But then I became an older child. And that preschool faith was not enough for me. It didn't explain what needed to be explained. And I had questions that people allowed me to ask and people were willing to address. And then I became an adolescent, and all hell broke loose. And people allowed me to doubt and allowed me to ask questions. And my faith grew more. And then I became a young adult. My ability to think and to study and ask questions grew as my brain grew. And my faith grew because I was allowed to question and to doubt. It was part of the process by which I not became further away from God, but came closer to God. Not by which my faith was weakened or undermined, but by which my faith was strengthened. Now here's the confession. From a very early age, I absolutely hated the Apostle Paul. He just rubbed me the wrong way. The things he argued in a lot of his letters just annoyed me. And I wanted to say, you're wrong. Somebody suggested to me, it might have been my brother who was older than I was and also becoming a pastor. It might have been my dad, it might have been a pastor. Said, don't throw it away. If you don't get it, if you don't agree with it, if it doesn't land with you, set it aside. Because tomorrow it might. Or the year after it might. Or a decade down the road it might. So I was given permission to fight him, to fight the Apostle Paul, to not like him, to not agree with him. And that was pretty much a lifetime of my relationship with him. And here's the interesting thing. I have come to really understand and really appreciate Paul's insights into our relationship with Christ and with God in a way that I never would have done if I had pushed my doubts to the side and pretended that I didn't have them. And now I find the letters of Paul to be incredibly powerful to me spiritually and intellectually. I think he's way, way smarter than many people give him credit for. I don't think he's the anti-woman male chauvinist that a lot of people accuse him of being. I think he has a real subtle and deep and profound and courageous understanding of what God was doing in the person of Jesus Christ. And I don't think that I would have come to the understanding of that being true if I had been discouraged from doubting, questioning, arguing, and wanting to wring his neck. Because I think my relationship to the apostle is real in a way that it would not have been. I even think I might not still be a Christian if I had just forced myself to believe things that I didn't believe, or think things that I didn't think. Doubt was a piece of the building and deepening and broadening of my faith. It wasn't the enemy, it was the ants in the pants. Because finally, the thing that we need to do is to draw close to God and to learn to trust God. And we only do that by bringing our full and real selves to God. Faith and doubt dance together. Because I have faith that God will be with me in my questioning and in my doubting and in my explorations and in my searching. I have faith that I won't be pushed out because I bring my real self and my real questions into the presence of God. But rather that my faith will become deeper and deeper. In the Old Testament, there's a book called Job. You might be familiar with it. Job is a story of a man, and the narrator tells us at the very beginning that Job was a man who had not sinned. He was blameless. And yet he suffers great loss. And the author tells that story in order to explore a common understanding of why bad things happen. And basically, bad things happen because you do bad things, and good things happen because you're good. That was the company line. The book of Job undermines and attacks that idea. So Job knows, because the narrator told him at the same time that the narrator told us, that he didn't sin. But he also knows that all his children and all his barns and all his animals are dead and crushed. So he has this thing going on. He doesn't know how to bring those two realities together. I'm sinless, but I have suffered. His three friends come and they make these three really boring arguments. And they make them 3 times. And by the time they're done, everybody, including God, is bored with their argument. And their argument boils down to, if you have suffered, you must have sinned. There's no other explanation. Job refused to buy into that. But finally he's had enough and he lets go and he says to God, this is totally unfair. This is unjust. This should not have happened because I was a really good person and now I am suffering and this is your fault. He lets God have it with both barrels. He holds nothing back. And then finally he runs out of steam and God opens up on Job with both barrels. Who do you think you are? Were you there when I laid the foundations of the earth? Were you there when I separated the sky from the land? Were you there when I separated the waters? Were you there when I created the animals? Were you there when I made the cosmos? Who do you think you are, God? So both Job and God have brought their full selves to each other. And then Job is quiet for a minute and he says, for a long time I've heard of you by the hearing of my ears, but now I've seen you face to face. In other words, because I brought my full self and the injustice of my situation to you and allowed you to have my anger and my doubt and my questions, now I feel close to you. Now I know you. Now I can let you be God. It's a powerful answer to the question, why do bad things happen to good people? It's the only one that I've ever heard that makes any sense at all to me. And it only happens because Job is willing to bring his pain, his questions, his doubts, and his anger to God. Which is what Thomas does. I won't believe it unless I can stick my hand in. I won't believe it until I can stick my finger in the holes in his hands. And the next week he's there with the disciples. Jesus enters the room. He doesn't wait for Thomas to ask. He says, Thomas, go ahead, stick it in. Thomas, go ahead, put your finger right here. Thomas, I'm real. I'm here with you. That moment would not have happened. That moment that drives Thomas to his knees, my Lord and my God, would not have happened if Thomas had been afraid to say, I'm not buying it. And I don't think that moment will happen for us unless we're willing to bring all the parts of ourselves, our questions, our doubts, our anger, our sense of betrayal, whatever it is, to the throne of God. Because it's only then that we will experience the real risen presence of Christ. You may be such a person. You have known certainly people who have done that, who have suffered, who have lost people that they loved, who've lost jobs and felt like they were worthless. You've met people who feel like they don't belong in the world because they aren't what other people expect them to be. You've known those people who have brought that to Christ and have experienced healing from Him. You've seen the risen Christ in people of faith around you. Perhaps you've been such a person in the life of someone else because you were willing to bring your whole self into relationship with God and because you encountered the risen Christ in reality. That is what John is trying to empower us to do and to be. That's what we are called, we who are in the generations that followed, are called to be and do. We're called to be the ones who bring our whole selves before God and become real servants, real apostles, real disciples who have experienced the presence of a real risen Savior. Thanks be to God.